On the next episode of Talkin Thrones, we're here at the halfway point of Season 1, Episode 5, entitled The Wolf and the Lion. And as the title suggests, the Starks and the Lannisters are about to go at each other's throats. Pat, any colorful commentary in order to kick this episode off?
I'm just going to say, lions, tigers, bears, and now wolves, oh my. On Talkin' TV, we're going to find out if the Starks survived their yellow brick wall.
All of that and more on the latest episode of Talkin Thrones. Stay tuned. All right, what's going on, man? Episode 5, we're here at the halfway point.
Yeah, I would say that this, first 4 episodes of the season, a nice mix of, basically explain the characters, exposition, and, now we're getting to the action. Now,
yes,
everything is firing on full cylinders.
Yes, we're quite literally at the point in the story, whatever story curve you want to go by, where it's like, yes, we're confrontation, right? As is stated multiple times in this episode, the wolf and the lion, the Starks and the Lannisters, obviously their respective sigils are going to go at each other. Ned is getting closer to finding out the mystery behind Jon Arryn's death. Robert finds himself in multiple crossroads in this episode. This is also, I didn't realize this the first 3 times that I watched the show, but this is the first episode to not feature Daenerys Targaryen or any of the characters on the other side of the Narrow Sea. Cat and Tyrion are making their way towards the Eyrie, and we meet some other members of Cat's family that you're like, oh, I don't necessarily know if this is the best course of action, to say the least. Things are really ramping up, and there's a lot to get into in this episode. So, I guess the only question that I have for you before we get this thing kicked off is, I don't know, do you remember much about this episode? When it first started, do you remember particularly oh man, this is the moment that I'm excited for, when you go into it?
I don't know about first excitement, but I will say that the Lysa scene in the Eyrie basically, hit me the same way now that it did before. Just the whole idea that she knows her husband was sort of plotted against and potentially murdered by the Lannisters. And now it's Catelyn shows up with Tyrion in this whole situation. And then, there's this 10-year-old kid that's still getting breastfed.
And
and he's, it's clear that he's sort of developmentally, has issues of some kind. And, the mother is not capable of really her senses either. And it's sort of leading into this extreme coddling that, the two of them are sort of, isolated from from reality, I guess is the easiest way to say it. I was just going to say, it's that storyline basically continues to deliver. And it's one of the more unique characterizations that ends up in the show.
Look, Lysa Arryn, obviously, as we know, is one of the more problematic characters to enter the show, but I definitely think that what you said about them kind of being isolated is true in a lot more ways than one, because as is stated by Tywin Lannister later on, Lysa actually has the fortune, at least until, a certain point in the show, of pretty much staying out of the conflict. After their little excursion at the Eyrie, in this sect of the season, we don't see them again, these characters, Lysa or Robin, until season 4, and then obviously, Lysa has her little fall and everything that happens there with Littlefinger. But I definitely find this episode was one that I was definitely looking forward to, because this was the point when I was reading the first book back in high school where I was like, oh boy, shit's about to go down. And when it ended, I had the same reaction in the book as I did when I watched it in the show. I'm like, okay, I don't necessarily know what the point of that was. I don't know if this is going to go anywhere, but obviously how it would fill out. Obviously later on, this was still just as crucial a step in the journey as the first 4 episodes were. My big takeaway from this episode is another scene that is completely original to the show, that was not in the books at all, but is, I think, quite possibly one of the best scenes in the entire show, which is the scene between Robert and Cersei right after Robert promptly fires Ned as Hand of the King, which just, I mean, we'll get into that later on, but like the writing in that scene, just the acting, it's some of the best Game of Thrones that there is, and it just kind of reminds me of everything that I love about this show, and it just all the subtext that goes into it, and kind of like what it casts as far as what's to come events wise, both within that individual scene for the rest of that season, and then for the rest of the show. Obviously, it's such a powerful scene. It's so impressive. Like Mark Addy and Lena Headey's performances, respectively, it's arguably the best that they've been in their entire tenures on the show. Mark Addy obviously only lasting 2 more episodes, but Lena Headey obviously for the rest of her tenure on the show. It was magnificent stuff, honestly. So
yeah, Tom, I'm gonna just go off on that and say that it's the scenes in which the actors are allowed to get into the characters and go deep that seem to really be successful here early on in the first season.
Yes, basically
it's characterization, it's world building, but it's also just fantastic acting.
Yes,
and that's one good example of it. And I think the next best example, it comes from this episode, and that's when Varys and Littlefinger.
Varys and Littlefinger, yes.
Yeah, they basically have their war of words. When was the last time I saw you, and you saw me, and Littlefinger thinks he has the upper hand, and it seems like Varys is down, but then I believe it was Renly. He comes in and he's like, "Oh, haven't you heard about this?" Yeah, and it seems that Varys totally won that war of the words,
which is funny because it seemed like for a minute Littlefinger was going to get the one up on him. But yeah, no, there were a lot of moments like that in this episode, which is funny because we say that this is an episode where there's a lot of plot and there's a lot of things happening, and there's obviously a big confrontation that happens at the end of this. But the thing that I think surprised me the most is how many individual like one-on-one moments there were. Like I said, that Littlefinger Varys moment, the Robert and Cersei moment, but also moments between Renly and Loras Tyrell, between Ned and Littlefinger, between Ned and Yoren, Ned and Arya. A lot of Ned and Barris and Selmy to open the episode. Like there's a lot of those like kind of brief one-on-one intimate moments, and that I think is another really kind of unsung thing about Game of Thrones that makes it so good and so compelling, is the fact that they're able to have like those micro-isms, those little one-on-one excellent character moments that really showcase the actors' abilities in the middle of all this action and all this craziness that's happening all around them,
Yeah, exactly. It's, now that you say Renly and Loras, like Loras was a very interesting character to introduce, and it's like you're bringing him into the fray. He's the what is he? The Knight of the
Knight
Rose?
of Flowers. Yes.
Yeah, and Sansa is like pining over him, and,
right?
It's like that's one great moment. She grabs Ned's arm and
it's like, please don't let anything happen to him.
Yeah, and it's like
great moment.
She was really traumatized by the joust in the previous
episode. I'm pretty sure that was her first time that she'd ever probably seen blood and someone dying in her entire life. So
yeah, true, and I think the thing about this joust scene that's awesome is that Sir Loras does ultimately knock the mountain off his horse and win the day, but then the mountain just goes crazy,
goes nuts, goes
and
ham.
So it really sets up that character as the sort of reckless, uncontrollable force that he is. And basically he only, the mountain sort of only walks away when Robert sort of steps in and brings his authority.
Right.
Which, the mountain's not really that controllable of a character throughout the rest.
He's not. He's 8 feet tall. He's literally referred to as Tywin Lannister's dog. And speaking of Robert, Robert, I think it's safe to say, is our focus character. This is some of the best. And ultimately, probably like the last time that he really has the chance to be like, this awesome and, impose his presence and his will before he kind of, gets off the way that he does, which is, obviously we're going to talk about the Robert scene with Cersei, and obviously, the famous small council meeting, which I remember even having a giant impact on me when I read it in the book. But another scene that I think is super underrated is the opening scene that he has with Ned, obviously, which starts off very, very funnily, obviously with poor Lancelot Lannister, who just cannot catch a break in this first season. What's called trying to fit Robert on his armor, and Robert just insults the ever-living shit out of him and says, "Go find the breastplate stretcher." And then Ned's like, "You're torturing the poor boy." And he's like, "How long do you think he's gonna figure it out before? How long do you think it's gonna take before he figures out that there's no such thing?" And he's like, "You should invent someone." But the thing I love about that moment is the fact that Ned almost has to like check Robert a bit bit because Robert is just so raring to go and so adrenaline filled and so ready to like, hit someone and get into the joust. And Ned has to step back, take a step back and remind him, it's like, dude, you're king. Like you can't enjoy all of the things that you did, when we were kids, when we were warriors, when we were knights. It's not the same. And I think that moment is very humbling for Robert because you see him sit down and he takes a step back and realizes just how much he kind of despises really being king. It's a very humanizing episode really for Robert Baratheon just in general.
Yeah, I think what's great about this episode is the fact that, Robert is limited by the past, right?
Right.
He doesn't have his youth anymore because he's been drinking and whoring and
In addition to the fact that I'm pretty sure he's on the wrong side of 40, but that's for all those other reasons that you said.
Okay, yeah. But like for age aside, it's more the fact that he's he's surrounded by Lannisters. He's sort of forced into these kind of limited interactions with his kingdom. Drinking is really his biggest escape.
Yeah.
Having fun. That's the things that he's easily can do. But the things like participating in the joust, well, no one's going to basically knock their king off the horse and bring harm to him. So the main thing is, like, Ned brings up a good point in that opening scene where it's like, you have respect of your people, and therefore it's like you're not going to be able to have those impromptu situations where you're going to come out ahead. Like everything is sort of canned. Like people are going to act differently, people are going to let you win, and that's the thing that Robert can't really handle, is that things have changed for Robert, whether or not it's he can't really fight a war anymore because he's king, he's won. And also it comes down to that scene where he's pining over a lost love that he'll never have again. But it's mainly his character is he just can't get over the past.
Yes,
and that's
indeed
what brings the tragedy to his particular circumstance.
Yes, indeed. We're going to talk about all of that in the rest of this episode. But for the first part, just in order to kind of get the plot recap kind of kicked off, like I said, there's a lot that happens in this episode, a lot. So mostly primary storylines. Like I said, this is the only episode, I believe, this entire season with no Daenerys, no Essos in it. Entirely takes place in Westeros. The prime storylines are Ned continuing to investigate Jon Arryn's death and, starting to receive help and tips from certain people, Varys, Littlefinger getting more into things. Cat and Tyrion continue their trek towards the Vale, in which Tyrion basically starts to admit that, he maybe Cat has not been told the truth as far as, just by breaking down some common sense as far as, what, in its own words, what sort of idiot would arm an assassin with his own dagger? Let's call it Bran and Theon have their own individual scenes, in Winterfell, obviously, where most of that are mostly just character based. Arya has a little bit to do in this episode as far as kind of chasing cats around, ends up stumbling upon some important information. And of course, Robert with his kind of, him being stuck in the past as far as everything goes. And the other big thing, obviously, which is how it ends, obviously, with that big encounter. So I guess, like I said, if you want to start by like breaking down like each interaction as far as that goes.
Dom, I only think there's really two things to talk about before we jump back into Robert. And that's basically like, Ned Stark and his investigation, it's pretty much not going anywhere.
Right.
It's reached the end. Okay, so Robert has some bastards.
Robert has bastards. Great.
But the main thing is at the beginning of the episode, Sir Hugh with the Vale.
Pat,
right?
No.
What's up?
Not StreamYard. No, don't do this.
What are you talking about?
Oh, come on. You there?
Yeah, I'm here. What's going on?
Oh, okay, good. StreamYard crapped out on us for a second.
Oh, okay.
StreamYard crapped out on us for a second. Okay, I think we're good. Okay, so anyway,
yeah, it didn't seem like it went out on my end. So
no, it didn't go out on my end either. So
basically, we're good. If it's stable, I'm just gonna say, Ned at the beginning of the episode is sort of investigating Sir Hugh and wondering how, like, two things really: how the match between the Mountain and him was put together, but also, how did Sir Hugh get such a fancy piece of armor?
Right.
And this is one of those things that's great about the show, is that it's clear to me watching this episode 10 years later that basically the Lannisters gave him a lot of money to allow them to murder Jon Arryn. And then basically they set him up against the Mountain so that the mountain could then kill a loose end that was part of the scheme.
Right. At least,
And
or so we're led to believe.
yeah, I don't, we'll never know for sure because that's not something that's fully explored. But, I think the pieces are all there and it's very subtle. And I think it works, right? And Ned kind of continues on his investigation and he's not really seeing the pieces. He's not really putting the bigger plot together. And essentially, towards the end of the episode when Arya is telling him, the plot, like they're out to get you, they're out to get Robert, whatever the case may be, because she overheard, the conversation in the dungeon. Basically, Ned is still, willing to track down leads and investigate. He wants to get to the truth. And I think it's that sort of like obsession over trying to figure things out that gets him in trouble because for the most part, when Littlefinger takes him to, I believe, his establishment to see another bastard, to prove his point, that's when Jaime comes in and confronts him.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting as far as how things line up, even now versus how they line up later on. But I think you brought up a really interesting point in kind of the pre-podcast discussion as far as the whole confrontation between Ned and Jaime, right? Because you said yourself that Benioff and Weiss apparently kind of hinted that it's like, oh man, this conflict has been building up between these two for the whole season. But it really hasn't, if you think about it, because they only had like 3 scenes, not even 2 scenes of like kind of jarring words. It's kind of like all in subtext, and it's kind of like reliant on your knowledge of the backstory of why these two kind of hate each other, as far as the residual judgment that Ned passed on Jaime, and Jaime kind of being really angry for him supposedly having done a deed that like was selfless, and all Ned can look at him as is somebody who betrayed his king, which is kind of ridiculous just given the inherent circumstances of that. So despite that, although the fight in and of itself is great, but I think the thing that kind of separates Ned from the bunch is the fact that he is still dedicated to the truth. He is still dedicated to finding out what happened to those that he cared about that have passed on. He's not kind of in it for for any sort of gain. He just wants to find out what the hell is going on, and rightfully so. And the interesting thing about what is told to him by a lot of the characters that seem to be, quote unquote, helping him in this journey is the fact that they're constantly dropping hints as to like, you're over your head, dude. You may be close to the truth, but trust me, you don't want to find out. And like, I think that the other interesting thing about the thing that happens in the dungeons as far as why it's Arya to overhear that is the fact that Arya is one of the characters who, as we follow on throughout the show, continues to prove that she wants to learn from the mistakes of the past, right? I feel like you see that progressively with those 3 Starks, particularly with Jon, Sansa, and Arya, right? But Jon is removed from a majority of the action for a majority of the series until season 6, and even though he does learn a lot on his own, and Sansa just has to undergo like just torment after torment after torment after torment, so she learns the absolute hardest of ways. But Arya is interesting because her whole thing is that she's kind of already starting to become aware of this kind of massive game that's going on before she even understands what it actually is at stake. Like, she overhears Varys and Illyrio, and they're talking about issues that she has no idea what they're talking about as far as the specifics of it, but we as the audience know, right? It's a little bit of that dramatic irony as far as that goes, which I think is really, really fascinating. I remember when I read that scene in the book originally, I absolutely loved it. It was filled with so much subtext, and there was a lot of stuff that was being talked about that I wasn't necessarily aware of at the time, but I still loved it. And the whole thing is that Arya, at the end of the day, is still trying to do good, but it's her kind of naive. She still has a little bit of that, like, of Ned's naivete, and it's the fact that she's the only one. Well, no, but it's the fact that she witnesses Ned's death from the position that she did, not like Sansa, who was standing right there thinking that Ned was going to be spared, but the fact that she tried to get up front and she tried to, do something to save him. It kind of shows her kind of Stark will, her own kind of Stark, if you will, as far as like how that gene code is kind of spread out throughout all the different Stark siblings.
Yeah, and I think, Ned, his tragedy is perfectly set up here in this episode because, if he did not listen to Littlefinger and he fled like he was meant to, right away, he met up with Arya and Sansa and they just went. He probably would have gotten out of King's Landing.
Right.
And they would have chased him and there might have been confrontation further down the road. But he probably would have either gotten to the Erie or gotten far enough north where allies would have came in, and basically we would have a completely different story. But it's because he got sucked in to this investigation, that sort of like curiosity that, basically he gets confronted by Jaime in the streets. He gets stabbed in the back of the leg and incapacitated, and then obviously he's going to face judgment for perceived crimes that we all know are manufactured.
It's the clear case of curiosity killed the cat, and ironically, a little bit of wordplay right there. But I think the other big thing too, as far as Jaime goes, is and again, just I think as far as part of the brilliance of Game of Thrones goes, is the fact that Jaime, once again, in a weird way, kind of contributes to what Varys and Illyrio are talking about in the dungeons. As far as it's like, the Starks and the Lannisters are already gearing up against each other. The Lannisters, Bran obviously saw, the key. He's like, Illyrio's asking like, how many of Robert's bastards has he found? He's like, almost all of them. He's like, he has the book. He knows Jon Arryn's last words. He'll figure it out soon enough. He's like, the Lannisters tried to kill Bran, and what's worse is they completely botched it. So now, obviously, they kind of brought the ire on themselves. And Jaime, I feel like in that last scene, this is his only scene in the entire episode, is living proof of that, where first off, Ned takes the fall when he finds out the cat has abducted Tyrion after Yoren tells him, and tells that to Jaime that Tyrion was obviously taken on his command, which I don't know, like, that's a weird move. Like, I get trying to be honorable, but also, like, he wants to protect Kat and try and, like, protect her from the ire of the Lannisters, because he doesn't know, obviously, where she is. But at the same time, it's like, dude, like, you're surrounded by people, it's just one of those senses where it's like, oh, honor trumps, common sense and intelligence in this case. But, because even if he does, like, manage to fight past Jaime, how is he going to get past, like, the 30 other Lannister guards that are standing right there? Obviously, unfortunately, when Jaime dispatches Jory the way that he does. But it's kind of funny how this is still obviously in Jaime's cocky days, like, before he, like, actually starts to, like, grow a conscience and learn a little bit. And I do find it interesting how, even though Jaime is supposedly part of this plot, to kind of overthrow, Robert, or at least case, or so we're led to believe, it's still continuously hilarious to me how his own hubris, it seems, consistently gets in the way of their success, because obviously it's his hubris that, that led him and Cersei to have that moment where they were caught by Bran, and then he even said that it's like, yeah, I'll kill Bran myself if he talks. It's like, bro, like, he just doesn't think at all. He just literally only acts, like, with his sword, as far as that goes. He lets his sword make all the decisions for him, and it almost, as Tywin gives him talking to in a later episode, like, it almost costs him, like, multiple times.
Yeah. I think it's one of those things where this is sets up perfectly what's going to happen next. I can't wait to see it, and, I'm ready. I'm just ready to fire up the next episode. So I can't wait to talk about the progression of events as they go forward.
Yes,
indeed. But I just want to go over the last sort of other element of this episode before we go back to Robert. Basically, it's, it is Ned's wife, Catelyn.
Yes.
Taking Tyrion to the Eyrie. And
I'm sorry. I love the look on Kat and Tyrion's faces, respectively, when they see Lysa breastfeeding her son.
Yeah,
they're both just staring at it with the biggest look of disgust. It's like, what the fuck are we watching on their face?
I think it's one of the greatest moments of, like, Tyrion somewhere on the road says, Lysa's changed. Like,
she's changed. She's not the woman you remember her.
Yeah, when's the last time you seen your sister? And then the first time we see it, it's this insane image.
Pretty much his follow-up line too, when he's like, and he killed our husband. He's like, oh, I killed the king's hand now, did I? I've been a very busy boy. Just like Tyrion's one-liners in this episode are gold, every single one of them.
Yeah, and what I just want to say is, like, to me, this storyline's kind of a pretty simple, like, okay, hey, we said we were going to Winterfell, but really we lied about that, and we're going to the Eyrie, and then they get attacked, and Tyrion can escape, but he decides to save Catelyn. Like, that, it's pretty straightforward what's happening there. Like, Tyrion is being shown as someone that is honorable, that he's, going to save Catelyn and not just think of himself. He is an intelligent character, but he is also honorable. And so, the two of them get to the Eyrie, and it's like they're in the same boat. Like,
yeah,
they're in this sort of dramatic situation where it's like, yeah, you're my prisoner, and I believe the Lannisters, specifically you had something to do with Bran, and I want some revenge. But I think even Catelyn at some point is going to realize, like, she's accusing the wrong person, and she basically got her family into such
even more trouble.
Basically, a big issue here. And then it doesn't help that Lysa is not of sound mind and is going to basically escalate the situation, or has the potential to escalate it, as we're, going to find out in the next.
As we see again, it's a good thing because Tyrion's intelligence and sense of common sense. Again, it's not anything really that is yet at a point where it can do anything substantial to the plot as we see, but it's still a point of where, okay, it definitely de-escalates things where they could have gotten a lot worse. And there's a reason why he's used very subliminally in this season, but how he is utilized is to show the stark difference between him and the rest of his family, as far as, okay, the rest of his family, it seems, are only bungling things and making things worse in whatever plot is going on, but he is the only one that, again, can see the outcomes before they happen and therefore can anticipate them and work with them. And I again, like, even though we don't really haven't really gotten to know who he is yet, I still think that Bronn has some truly incredible one-liners in this episode. Where he literally, I think one of the best lines just in general in the show is when they arrive at the Eyrie and Tyrion's like, the Eyrie, they say that she's impregnable. And Bronn, of course, is like, give me 20 good men and some pikes and I'll impregnate the bitch. And I'm just like...
Yeah, Bronn is that...
Bronn's the best.
Yeah, he's foul-mouthed, and, it's the things that he say are unexpected, and he is such a good ally to Tyrion, and
yes,
it kind of becomes like a really fantastic character to follow throughout the series.
Yes,
but anyway, I me personally, I don't really think much happens in this sequence of events.
Right.
It's really setting up for what happens next.
Right.
So I'm ready, if you are, to talk about Robert.
Yeah, definitely. The only thing that I wanted to mention first is that Renly Loras scene, which again is obviously a follow up to that amazing scene at the beginning, obviously, where Loras Tyrell ultimately where Loras Tyrell ultimately unseats Gregor the Mountain Clegane, and Gregor goes nuts, kills his horse, and then almost kills Loras right there, if not for the Hound stepping in. And then we obviously have that scene later on that is revealed that Renly and Loras are both gay and very much in love with each other. A sequence that was very much only hinted at, although very strongly, obviously, in the books. And again, it's a small scene, but again, a very important scene because it sets up, obviously, later on, it begins Renly's quest towards where he goes in the next season as far as wanting to be king. Yeah. And it definitely shows how Loras kind of sets up and pushes him towards that. But no, definitely, let's get to our...
I'm definitely glad you brought that up.
Yeah.
I totally forgot about it. But essentially, it's, I think the major detail is Loras saying, my family has money. I support you. You should be king. It's showing us the idea that there are many different factions.
Right.
That there is sort of a much bigger picture for that throne than just the Lannisters taking it. And so it's really that scene sets up the early days that, the motion that, that the Lannisters put into effect with trying to steal the throne for, centuries to come, basically is such a fool idea, because
a fool's errand.
Yeah, because everybody else is already ready to go to gun for that throne. And I think that Loras and Renly scene really sets that up and makes it absolutely clear. And it's such a very subtle scene. So I'm glad you brought that back up. But
definitely.
Let's segue over to Robert.
Yeah, because I mean, Renly in a way almost kind of does segue into Robert, because the interesting thing about Renly is the fact that, Renly, even though he is a character who I feel like many others on the show, kind of gets killed before he has the chance to really do anything of substantial. The interesting thing about Renly is Renly was famously born when Robert and then their brother Stannis as well, who we have not been introduced to yet, were already into their teens. So Renly is kind of like what's the term for a sibling that's born? Renly is an accident child for all intents and purposes, and it's true. As far as how that goes.
I think if we go back to the first episode when they give Jon the runt of the litter, I think Renly would fit into that runt of the litter category.
Renly fits into that category perfectly, and it's interesting because while Renly is consistently feeling like he's out of place, and is not getting the respect necessarily that he feels is earned of him, if Robert, it seems like, has the opposite problem, right? As we transition into our focus character segment, right? Robert, even though he loves Renly, Robert is adored by everyone, is loved by everyone, even if they don't necessarily like him as a person per se, they have respect for him as a king and as a warrior because he's won all these things. He saved the realm perchance from the wrath of Mad King Aerys Targaryen, and now like you brought up before, he's kind of stuck in the past. He's kind of stuck in this kind of wave of nostalgia. All he does is fantasize about Lyanna. He drinks, he hunts, he hates really actually having to focus on being king as far as that goes. And it's ultimately kind of that being stuck in the past that in a way sets things up for the disaster that is ultimately coming, because as is mentioned by multiple people, both during his reign and after, by Barristan Selmy, by Tywin Lannister, by everyone else, like Robert is essentially bankrupt the kingdom and run it into ruin just to kind of, continue to support his lofty, a fantasy that ultimately no longer exists anymore. I think you see it all throughout this episode. You see it in the beginning scene, obviously, with Ned. You see it in that excellent scene with Cersei. You even see it in a sense of in the small council meeting when he is screaming loudly for Daenerys and Viserys to be killed, because again, they're, like Ned says, they're not there. They will become a threat, obviously, if they are not dealt with in due time, but they're not a threat yet. And obviously, as Ned has made clear multiple times, even though he is an honorable man and will do what needs to be done, he is not a fan of killing children. In fact, famously, there was a sequence that was portrayed in the initial rebellion, in Robert's rebellion, where after the Lannisters bring out the bodies of Rhaegar Targaryen's wife and children and present them to Robert, and Robert says that, Robert commends them for doing it, and Ned is disgusted by just the blatant butchery of innocence. It's always been a very, very stark difference between the two of them, despite their close friendship, and it's on show here, and Ned even points out Robert is scared of a ghost. He's scared of the ghost of Rhaegar Targaryen and Aerys in the form of, Rhaegar's two siblings, who at this point are not a threat. He even says she's a child, and the fact that all the other small council members just go along so easily with Robert without even a second's hesitation. Obviously, we know Varys is doing some double dealing, but Renly, Pycelle, Littlefinger, they all just go along with Robert. It really does, again, like I think contribute to overall his his complexity as a character, because as we know, even though Ned has such this adoration and this friendship with him, he's ultimately a very, very troubled man. He is an abuser. He ultimately does not have a lot of respect for people who are not to his caliber. He ultimately, I don't even think he particularly likes being around people that much, just as far as, just as how his interactions with everyone go,
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. Robert is not exactly the shining light of charisma in this kingdom. like I guess he is in terms of
he is and he isn't
going after the ladies and having illegitimate children, but for the most part, when it comes to like dealing with the Lannisters, he hates them all. He makes clear to them all that he hates them. So it's almost like, he fought this, rebellion. He got the kingship, but to hold on to it, it's like he's surrounded himself by his enemies. And he really is just, ultimately a figurehead. And I think he understands that. But as long as he's king, he's going to at least get what he wants, and have a good time. And, it's one of those things where I don't think Robert really sees these sort of, the clutches seizing around his neck for what's about to happen.
Like at the very, Varys even says it, right? It's the fact that if Ned is unaware of the claws that are slowly coming in, Robert is even less aware, because Robert is still in this, position and this idea that he thinks, that he's the king and that his rule, that at the end of the day, his word is the word of law, and he doesn't realize that there are conspirators, going behind his back and trying to end his reign. But he also is so stuck in his own head that he doesn't even realize that like his rule is not nearly as strong as he says. But then, right, just when you think that he's not as self-aware as you think, he has this beautiful moment with Cersei where he says, it's like, I understand that there are still people out there that called me usurper. There are still people who don't respect me as much. When he has that whole discussion with Cersei where he breaks down the logistics of what will happen if the Dothraki invade. And the ironic thing is the fact that everything that he says is completely 100% correct as far as what happens when the Dothraki do arrive in Westeros as far as the damage goes. He says, yeah, we shore up in our castles. The smart thing to do. No one would dare fight the Dothraki on open field because everyone knows that, well, at least until we get to the last season, the Dothraki are unstoppable in open combat. So they shore up in their castles, and the Dothraki go around looting, burning, pillaging every farm, and he says, how long before do the people continue to respect me? My will is only as good as my might. And if I show that I am not mighty and play the smart play, it's ultimately an unwinnable scenario. And he does have this knowledge, even though, again, he doesn't realize that he's talking to the woman who is ultimately going to have him killed in 2 episodes.
Yeah, well, also, the whole idea of like what's stronger, 1 or 5, and
5 or 1, yeah.
Cersei walks into it and says 5 because she's going to play the game. She understands what he's getting at. But for the most part, he's right. If you're in the 7 kingdoms, you're separate armies, you're not united. There is this whole potential for a fight over the throne. Whereas, Dany and sort of Dothraki, they would be one unified army under their new child. And if they got here, it would be sort of that,
catastrophe.
Moment. And the thing that I like about this is, we have from the beginning of this season, this idea that the White Walkers are returning, and that's looming over everything, but we haven't really returned to it.
Right.
And for the most part, it's like we're getting to the point where we're very intricate in the whole idea that how fragile the 7 kingdoms are. And we really have gotten to a very complex point where we understand, that this house of cards is really going to start falling apart. And when the White Walkers sort of return into the fray, into the story, it's going to be like that shoe dropping, the other shoe. And we're going to have that oh shit moment.
Yes.
Where we know that, like, oh, well, they just broke the kingdom. Can they fix it by the time the White Walkers ultimately go beyond the wall?
Right, which again is the thing that you thought would happen by the end of the show, but then it doesn't. But again, that's not for now. We'll save that for when we get to the last 6 episodes, which I think that I'm already thinking ahead kind of because that's just where my brain goes. I think that by the time we get to the last 6 episodes, I think we should just have a roast fest where we just point out all the problems with each of those 6 episodes and why it ultimately just goes against kind of what this show is setting up. And I think the only thing that I really have left to say about Robert before we get into the gotcha for segment, because the gotcha for segment is going to be a little bit different in this episode, because I want to talk about just that scene between Robert and Cersei because of how good it is. But I think the thing that is ultimately the tragedy of Robert Baratheon, we talked about the tragedy of Ned Stark and what that is, but the tragedy of Robert Baratheon is the fact that he is ultimately a man who fought so hard for what he wanted, right? We talk about different tragedies as far as different of these characters, right? Catelyn, ultimately, it's just every single tragedy that she has suffered in her life comes from the hands of the Starks, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Ned Stark's ultimately comes from the fact that he is so in the thick of things that he doesn't realize just when he needs to get out. And by the time he does realize it, it's too late, and it's ultimately the end for him. Tyrion kind of is able to finagle his way around all of those problems because he can actually see the outcomes before they happen as far as that goes, and because he seems to be the only one that has enough common sense to really be able to work around it. And Robert's whole thing is that Robert ultimately, besides being stuck in nostalgia land, is the fact that Robert is ultimately a person who fought so hard for everything that he wanted, right? Because he's a man of want, right? That's the whole thing. That was his characteristics before he even became king, is what Robert says goes, and what he wants, he gets. And by the time he got it, he didn't realize just how much he had lost trying to get it, and now he's just in this place of misery, and he's just stuck. Literally almost to the point where it's almost like death is a relief to him, which is kind of crazy when you consider it, but he even says it. He's already laughing as he's on his way out. He's like, I still got the last laugh. King Robert Baratheon, this great big warrior killed by a pig, as he says in 2 episodes. So that's really all that I got to say about Robert Baratheon as far as our focus character segment. Again, I think he's a fantastic character, and for him to have as much as an impact as he does in only 7 episodes of the 73 episodes, I think it's a testament. It's a testament to Mark Addy as an actor. I do think that, again, the Emmys are what they are, but I definitely think that if there was anybody else from this season in particular that should have gotten the Emmy nomination besides Peter Dinklage, it would have been Mark Addy for his performance as Robert Baratheon, and that's really all that I have to say about it. So let's talk about the gotcha first segment. Let's talk about Cersei and Robert's marriage, right? The thing that, as they say in that brilliantly written sequence, is supposedly the thing that's been holding the kingdom together for this entire time. So the way that this happened is obviously famously after the war, right? After the war was done, Ned found Lyanna. She was already dead, so unfortunately Robert was not able to marry her as was originally intended. So Jon Arryn famously suggested that since the Lannisters kind of helped to turn the tide of the war at the end of the rebellion, and obviously since Tywin Lannister had a lot of money, and it would help as far as, beginning to unify the political fracture that had happened within the kingdom, Jon Arryn famously suggested that Robert should marry Cersei, even though by that point Robert was already hung up on Lyanna Stark's ghost. The interesting thing is that even though we kind of know that the marriage between Robert and Cersei is a loveless marriage, Cersei at one point actually did love Robert. She did care for him. She did feel something, this big, burly warrior that had just won this entire thing. She was madly loving him at one point until she actually married him. And then she found out what type of person she was. And then she realized what she had to deal with. And it kind of like created this souring effect that has led to where they are now. But the interesting thing, I think, amongst everything else, right, that happens within this one sequence between the two of them is the fact that she's still kind of poking and prodding. She's still trying to see, like, is there anything in there? Is there anything left? Like, is there any chance that we have to salvage this? Because this is going to be the only moment that he has, if he has it at all. And the fact that he is so solemn and so steadfast in his response, as far as just saying, no, there was never a chance between us. It's so heartbreaking and so tragic, but it's so finite, and it's so like kind of it's the shit that I wish just like all of my stories were about, that they had this much depth and this much subtext within their sequences and scenes.
Yeah, what I would say is, I'm going to take what you said. I'm going to take like a little bit of a contrarian point is that, I think Cersei, given her family, they probably would have trained her or at least informed her that like this is likely a loveless marriage. Like,
right.
You're gonna basically be marrying for our gain. So I think, before the marriage even took place, she might have been aware. And, to a certain degree, like her whole situation, and this sort of goes to her character is like, she's able to say, I was vulnerable and, this is how I felt. And like, I felt like if I brought up, her name, basically, it's like you wouldn't love me. Whatever the case might be, is like she basically withheld it out of spite, and she says all this stuff, but at the end of the day, it's like, did she really ever have a chance of loving him?
Right.
The same question she asked him, like, was there ever a chance of him loving her? And, it's like, it's never really explored in the show, but I would almost suggest that, both characters, there might never have really been a chance that they would have loved each other, even though that Cersei is saying like, there was a time in which, I kind of pined over you. Maybe that's false information. Maybe that's just her sort of getting into the psychology of her husband.
Right. And I think also, too, as far as, kind of the final nail in Robert's metaphorical coffin that he's constructing around himself before he finds himself, in an actual one is, him, Cersei finally asking about Lyanna and her kind of saying finally, he even says, he's like, you've never asked about her at all. Why now? And she's like, at first I wanted to hate her, but then after a while I said, it's like, what more harm could Lyanna Stark's ghost that we already haven't done to each other already, And he finally said, and I think the moment where he admits, again, it's so fucking brilliant. Just the acting here is just unbelievable. He even says, he's like, the sad truth is I don't even remember what she looked like. I can't even remember her face, I just know that I wanted her, I just know that I wanted her. Someone took her from me, and 7 kingdoms couldn't fill the hole that she left. It's just kind of that sense of like objectivism, just more demonstrative of his characteristics of like, he just wants to own things without actually understanding their proprietary value. And I think that's true of Cersei, where it's almost kind of the opposite case, where he is just so distant of Cersei without even realizing what it is that he had. Again, I'm not going to try and make any justification towards Cersei as a character, but I do think that if Robert had almost taken a step back and gotten out of his own way, there might have almost been a chance as far as that goes, because again, she is power hungry and she is aspirational as far as that goes. But like, obviously, as we learn down the line, she's not exactly the best at ruling, but like, there could have been a chance as far as that goes for them to create the most powerful dynasty ever. But it's just the fact that there was just too much baggage going in beforehand. So they really never did stand a chance.
Yeah, no, I agree. Like, Robert is sort of this tragic character that, he pretty much did the rebellion. He took over, he became king, but like ultimately that was not the thing that, he was destined for. Like, and the fact that he could never get what he truly wanted is what leads him to sort of be this guy that's sleeping around, that's having illegitimate children, that has this, wife and step family that really is at his throat. It's really just like he's a destroyed man because he could not get married to this woman, and like he just lets it destroy him.
Right.
And it's slow, it burns over time, and it's sort of something that we're now seeing as the audience, that this is sort of going to be the end, and it's going to bring so much chaos for the next couple seasons of the show.
Yeah, I think that's again another thing that's very heavily hinted at in this scene is kind of the further damage that's caused by the rift in their marriages, as we see once their marriage ends, like the entire realm devolves into chaos, and he's already kind of hinting at it within that scene, obviously with the whole 5 versus 1, what's a greater army, and I think the idea of him bringing up just the idea of what's it called? One army, a real unified army fighting for a single purpose. Our purpose died with the Mad King. Now we're all a bunch of squabbling lords struggling for micro things, and everybody wants something different. It's kind of, he does have this, it's kind of a big part of the conundrum. He does have the understanding that things are falling apart, but yet he either does not he either doesn't really understand that he can actually, step in and do something, or he just doesn't want to, and he just doesn't care. Because as we see when Cersei leaves, all he's doing is just pouring that wine for himself and just continuing to drink. He has no desire to intercede, just none at all. And it's ultimately, again, it's part of what kills him.
Yeah, ultimately, I think he just sort of lost the will to really push these points. He's really bringing them up at the last minute. It's like he knows like he should have hammered this home, that he should have really rallied the 7 kingdoms behind some sort of cause, but he just never did it. And, it's going to lead to the situation that they're in now.
Yes.
But anyway, Dom, enough about what we think.
Yes.
I think it's that time of the episode where we throw up the comments and see what our chat's been saying.
So we've got the one and only reliable Eric Thorpe showing up. Thanks for showing up again, Eric. This episode is where things really heat up. If I remember right, you would be correct. And he also mentioned that the mountain is terrifying even before he's a zombie, which is true. Also played by 2 different actors before he becomes 100%. A zombie as well. Famously, the mountain is played by Conan Stevens, and this season is portrayed by Ian White, who is a famous, what's called character actor who portrays multiple giants and other like kind of big parts. He also, I believe, played one of the Predators in the Alien vs. Predator movie. He portrays Gregor the Mountain Clegane in season 2 before ultimately Hafthor Julius Bjornsson comes in to play him in the final season. Yes, indeed, Lysa does admit that she poisoned her husband in season 4, which is what makes this whole grand conspiracy kind of a little bit confusing, because we talked about. Also, we got a new subscriber, Man of Movies, says, "Hey guys, Eric recommended the channel. Just subbed, only able to watch for a bit, but happy to be here. What's up, Eric?" Oh, thanks, man. That was what's it called? That's it's really helpful, definitely.
Hey, word of mouth, telling other people.
Indeed, it does help.
That subscribe button and the bell, all that stuff. I know it's like gimmicky, like everybody on YouTube's got to say that, but unfortunately, it does help. It's all starts with you. We're just trying to talk about our favorite TV shows, and hey, just give us a little nudge in the right direction.
Yes, indeed. And before we get out of here and wrap this episode up, we of course have the death count episode. The deaths are ticking up each and every episode. There were a lot of unnamed character deaths. Definitely, we're trying to focus mostly on named character deaths, but like all the poor Hills tribesmen and various knights that were killed in that little skirmish as they were on their way to the Vale. And also all of
important death, the horse,
the horse, of course, Gregor's horse that he just cut his head clean off. It's like, okay, like I get that the mayor is bucking a little bit, but like, come on, man.
If Sansa was traumatized by the day before, I think she's traumatized now.
This is the peak of her trauma. Sansa just goes from trauma to trauma to trauma to trauma. But of course, we do unfortunately have to say goodbye to another named character in this episode again. We didn't get that much time with him, but the time that we did spend was valuable enough. R.I.P. Jory Cassell, Roderick Cassell's son, the head of Ned Stark's guard that accompanied him to King's Landing. Unfortunately, tried to engage Jaime Lannister, the Kingslayer, one-on-one, and even though he is very brash, there was a reason why. He actually has, the might to back up the brashness, because, oh man, he didn't even get a chance to make one swing before Jaime just pulled out his dagger and boop, right in the eyes. So, R.I.P. Jory, you will be missed, by all those who actually remember your name. And you have any words to say to commemorate Jory Cassell's memory?
Dom, I guess the only thing I have to say is hopefully rest in peace. It's the character. We didn't spend much time with him. He sort of got slapped around in King's Landing and then just murdered.
Indeed. So R.I.P. Jory Cassell. That was our death ticker. Yes, indeed, Eric Jory. And with that being said, that was another episode of Talkin Thrones. What did you guys think? What do you guys think ultimately of the shorter runtime? Do you think it's better for us? Let us know in the comment section below. Be sure to click the subscribe button. Click the bell next to it. That way you guys get notified every single time we put up new content. We'll be back next week. We're at the halfway point. 5 more episodes to go, and then we're done with the first season of this show. Thank you guys once again for tuning in each week. Again, as we stated in this episode, things are only beginning to heat up. Pat, where can the good people find you on the interwebs?
Listen, I keep threatening that someday I'll post on Instagram at Patrick W. Huber. So hit me up there if you want to find me, and eventually I will post something. I take photos. I do. I swear. I just never get to actually posting them, but someday I will.
All right. And you can find me, of course, on our regular business Facebook and Instagram at Talkin TV Podcast on Facebook and Instagram. And you could also follow me personally on my personal Instagram at Movie Nerd Reviews, all one word. I've been posting a lot of trailers recently because there's been a lot of trailers dropping for a lot of good movies that are upcoming. So stay tuned, obviously, for more Talkin Thrones. 12 seasons in a short film. And as always, watch more fucking movies. We'll see you guys next time.